So yeah, I'm sensing this like whole Team Cetacean versus Team Pinniped thing, and I'd just like to thank Team Pinniped for accepting me as one of their own, even though I'm technically an other. But my name is Michael Pawlik. I'm a veterinary pathologist at the Plant and Animal Health Center in Abbotsford, British Columbia. I am literally across the hall from Stephen Rafferty, so it's a great privilege. Unfortunately, he never leaves his office, so it's all for naught. This was just a project that I was working on during my pathology residency. I was stuck in the prairies for 11 years, and I really wanted a taste of home, so I decided to do a project on marine mammals. And so this was under the supervision of Stephen Rafferty and Trenton Bollinger. So just a bit of background as to what motivated this project. So over the years, there's been a significant decline in otter populations along the Aleutian Islands, in particular in Alaska. And there's also been increased rates of mortality of California sea otters, which has resulted in stalled population recovery. And so in British Columbia, the health status of the sea otters is largely unknown. However, recently there have been proposed projects in resource development, namely the Northern Gateway Pipeline, which unfortunately got stopped, that sort of may have threatened sea otter populations, and we thought it was very important to sort of get a better understanding of the health status of sea otters in the area before such projects went underway. And so the goals of this project was to review the data that was collected over the years from stranded and live captured otters, and to establish a baseline health status so that we could recognize, gauge, and understand any changes that may have occurred in the future. We also wanted to use data from neighboring otter populations, because a lot more research has been done in Alaska and California, and use that information to sort of better assess any potential hazards that might be facing British Columbia's otters. So here's just a map showing the distribution of sea otters as per 2014. So the population's quite strong. It's at 4,600 roughly as of 2014, and this is from 70, which were reintroduced into Checklasheet Bay way back when, so in the 60s, after they were extirpated from British Columbia. So despite the growing population, carcass recovery is abysmal. So over a period of 15 years, we only recovered 27 otters in total, which we performed necropsies on, and as you can see, 12 we couldn't even gender. That's the state of postmortem preservation. So imagine diagnosing a disease in such a rotten carcass. So here's a bit more of a detailed map showing where these otters came from. So we don't really have much representation of the Central Coast population. However, we had one straggler in Haida Gwaii, even though there's no established population there. So he was probably swimming across the strait there. But as you can see, our sampling is rather biased in areas that actually have an established population. So Port Hardy, Ucluelet, that's where most of our sea otters came from naturally, and that's where most of the people are. The region between is tiny little fishing villages, so we really don't have too many people surveying those areas, and thus our population in that area isn't well sampled. There's also, as a result, a gender bias. I'm sure you saw in the last slide. We had 11 males that were identified and only 4 females. That's also because the distribution of otters isn't even in terms of gender across the population. The females tend to congregate around the middle of the population, whereas the males, they kind of explore the peripheral regions, and so Port Hardy and Euclid are kind of at the periphery of their population. So primary causes of mortality, there you go, unknown, 13 out of 27. And this could be, again, because a lot of the carcasses were autolyzed and scavenged. However, there are also a number of diseases that don't really leave a lot of evidence. So drowning, for one, and hypothermia. So I'm going to take a jab at the other marine mammals for a second, but unlike most other marine mammals, which have like a very fat sausage-like conformation, sea otters are cute and cuddly, and they're really fluffy, and so they really depend on their fluffy pelage in order to insulate themselves against the elements. And anything that could intervene with their grooming patterns or with the insulative properties of the pelage can cause additional stress and hypothermia. So that's why they're so prone to oil slicks and oil spills. Now, ballistic trauma was another issue we saw. So in 2 of the 27 otters, they were shot, and there are certain conflicts with particularly the shellfish industry that result in these incidents. So ignoring causes of mortality and just looking at diseases of interest, because there's certain diseases of interest that don't really kill the otter or may contribute to the death, you get a nicer picture. So again, bacterial infection is actually a quite common finding, and this is often associated with traumatic injury or gastrointestinal disease. However, bacterial infection was occasionally a primary cause of mortality as well. We had one otter with a bronchopneumonia. As for traumatic injury, as I already mentioned, we had a couple gunshot cases, but a lot of the injuries that they sustained, it's very difficult to tell where these injuries came from. So we had certain injuries that looked like ship strikes. So there was a tail tip amputation, vertebral fractures that could be either hit with a propeller or hit with the hull of the boat. We can't be sure. So, but what really interested us was some of the pathogens that they had. So I'm only going to touch on some of the major ones. So one of the otters that died from sepsis had what looked like an aberrant migration of acanthocephalans. So these are gastrointestinal parasites that usually remain within the intestine. However, when they bore through the walls of the intestine, they can carry with them bacteria, which can then spill into your abdominal cavity and cause sepsis. And so we couldn't identify the parasite. However, it's worth mentioning that there's a genus of acanthocephalans in California, Pawlik, which is associated with fairly high levels of mortality. So between 1998 and 2001, of all the otters that they found beach cast, 25% of the mortalities were attributed to this aberrant infection. And so members of the genus Pawlik are actually, well, of the ones that are affecting the otters are actually parasites of seagulls, but as a result of, oh, 1 minute left. Okay, so as a result of changes in marine ecosystem health, it's caused a shift in their foraging patterns and diets, where they're now relying on poor quality feed, and they come into more frequent contact with these parasites, and so that increases mortality. So something to keep an eye on in our populations. However, because the populations are still fairly low, there's an abundance of high-quality nutrition in British Columbia. So, and not to mention, there's no evidence that this particular genus of parasite has established on Vancouver Island yet. So, Toxoplasma gondii, something most people who deal with marine mammals are familiar with. Sea otters are particularly prone to this based on the fact that they sit in the nearshore marine environment, and they love filter-feeding organisms, which tend to concentrate the infective stages of this parasite. So this infects the brain, causes meningitis. They either die directly as a result of this, or they're more prone to predation because it alters their behavior. And so we didn't actually confirm a case of this in the 27 otters. However, there was one that was rather suspicious. So this was an otter from Sook, BC, which had an elevated titer to Toxoplasma gondii, neurological disease, and lesions that were neither suggestive of it. But one of the most interesting findings, and the last one I'm going to cover, was Sarcocystis neurona. So this, like Toxoplasma gondii, is an apicomplexan parasite, except the definitive host is the Virginia opossum, unlike the cat, which is the definitive host of Toxoplasma gondii. Now, what makes this an interesting find, so 2 of the 27 otters we sampled died as a direct result of Sarcocystis neurona infection in the brain, but there are no Virginia opossums close to this otter population, which the nearest opossums would be Hornby Island, so way up here on the east coast of Vancouver Island, and on the Olympic Peninsula, and this is where our sea otter was found, so over 100 kilometers away. So there's a lot of speculation as to how this animal is exposed, but there's the potential for maybe oceanic birds acting as a transport host for the parasite. From a Virginia opossum somewhere else, transport them over to west coast Vancouver Island, and then infect sea otters. So, in conclusion, we have found that there are diseases in British Columbia that are causing significant mortalities in neighboring populations. There's a great need to improve carcass recovery so we can get a better idea of to what extent these diseases are affecting our population. And I just wanted to reiterate the importance of otters as a keystone species, maintaining the health of the nearshore marine ecosystems, and how they are valuable sentinels of marine ecosystem health. And so I'd like to thank the Plant and Animal Health Center, Stephen Rafferty, Trent Bollinger. Here are my references, and if you had any questions.
So Michael might not know, but the reason we have people like Michael speaking about parasitology, we do it after lunch. Because some of the pictures can be upsetting and cut down appetites.
I heard Rafferty was notorious for putting gross images up, so I tried to cut back on those.
And he unfortunately was not able to be here today. Do we have any questions for Michael? On the front
Oh, I
side?
can't see, I'm blind. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Repeat
the
the question.
from what I understood the question, you're asking what monitoring is happening of the otters in British Columbia and what my project is. So monitoring is rather passive at present. So most of the otters that we did were just found by Good Samaritans and submitted to the Animal Health Center, where Stephen Rafferty was just performing necropsies over the years. And so this was just a retrospective study. It wasn't really a planned kind of project. There are, I think, they do seroprevalence studies every now and then for canine distemper and a couple other pathogens I'm not too familiar with. But thus far, our active monitoring is quite limited, so we don't really know a whole lot about the health status of otters here. Does that answer your question? Okay.
We're going to pass. Go on. Thank you very much.